as mentioned, I'm. You did mention that I was taking a PhD, right?
No, doing a PhD?
Yes. I'm doing a
Not
PhD.
done yet?
No, well, it's my second one, so
That's what I was saying.
yeah, I'll just keep doing them as long as they're.
We need you to give a presentation on how we do that as well.
So I'm currently doing a PhD in Portugal, in a specific topic of that PhD. It's learned magic in early modern Portugal. So I'm examining mostly the records of the Inquisition, looking for mentions or instances or trials of individuals who were persecuted for owning, commercializing, or practicing the contents of a magic book, specifically focusing on books. While the topic, the main concern of that project isn't books of Saint Cyprian by themselves, obviously this is a topic that's unavoidable if you're talking about not only learned magic, but just magic in general in the Portuguese context, the Portuguese and Iberian and even South American context. So, throughout the past years, I have collected a number of references and mentions to what appear to be pre-contemporary books of Saint Cyprian. And even I was fortunate enough to, through sheer force of stubbornness, be able to find a couple of manuscripts already. And so the point here is just to, in a loose context, the content here is academic, but the form doesn't need to be. Just tell you all about these several references I found, these several books I've also found, and hopefully everybody will have somewhat of a rough idea of what books of Saint Cyprian have been in the Portuguese context from the 17th century to the 19th century. So to then begin, we should always start with the contemporary book of Saint Cyprian. This is the cover that's most famous, historically famous in Portugal right now. This is the cover of the Book of Saint Cyprian, as published by the Livraria Económica, which is currently this is a mid-19th century book, but it's currently the contemporary books of Saint Cyprian that you can buy in a Portuguese bookstore are still largely the same as this one. So this is what today would be called the standard Portuguese version of the Book of Saint Cyprian. This particular edition is most famous because this is one of the versions of the Book of Saint Cyprian that the Portuguese National Library digitalized, and it's available to the public and has been for a few years. The last time I checked the Portuguese National Library's digital archives, they currently have 4 different versions of the Book of Saint Cyprian. We can talk about them a bit later, but this is so far the most fundamental one if you want to talk about Saint Cyprian right now in Portugal. Now, this book is made up of 3 different parts. The 2 first parts actually make up an older book. So the contemporary book doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from a clear literary tradition. There was an older book, which basically was just the first 2 parts of the contemporary book. And then at a certain point, a 3rd part is added, and that made the contemporary book the contemporary book. In terms of structure and content, the first 2 parts are the first part actually is the more complex and probably more interesting of the whole bunch. It contains a prescription for a particular use of the prayer of Saint Cyprian for the banishment of evil spirits and sorcery. The prayer of Saint Cyprian is by itself a long-standing, let's call it Western magical prayer. You can find versions of it a bit everywhere, from the Arabic world to Scandinavia to everywhere. And the purpose of the prayer of Saint Cyprian is typically that which is prescribed in this first part of the Book of Saint Cyprian, which is the banishment of evil spirits and sorcery. This first part also has a reuse of the same prayer of Saint Cyprian to find and disenchant buried treasure. And besides that, it has collections of various sorceries of an apparent folk nature. This same tendency is continued in the second part of the book, which is mostly just a collection of various sorceries from several sources, and also in the third part. But the third part is particular because there seems to be somewhat of an imperial or colonial preoccupation in the third part. There are several mentions to Brazil and other regions of the Portuguese Empire, which should, to me, it actually suggests that this third part might have been something produced in Brazil. I'm not personally offended by that notion that the contemporary Portuguese book might actually be a Brazilian production. As such, this is a book that is clearly and oftentimes explicitly fragmented. You can find pieces of text and information, sorceries and recipes, which can be tracked to several different written sources, several sources from different periods and from different cultural contexts, from learned contexts to folk rural contexts. So given this this fragmentary nature, when you deal with the Book of Saint Cyprian, at least the Portuguese version, from an academic perspective, from a historical perspective, there are always three levels of history that you need to consider. The first level of history is the history of the idea of the Book of Saint Cyprian itself. What is it that people mean when they say the words Book of Saint Cyprian in different historical and cultural contexts? This changes and this evolves throughout time. The second level of history is the history of individual known versions of this book. You have to try to figure out, if possible, you need to figure out the authors, the origin, and again, the historical and cultural context. Each book needs to be an object in itself. And the third level of history is the history of every individual section of this book. As a fragmented book that gets deconstructed and reconstructed throughout history, every single procedure that is described in this book will have its own history. When does it come into the books of Saint Cyprian? Does it leave? Does it come from somewhere that we can trace? Is it from a folk origin or a learned origin? So these three levels of history need to be present every time we look into this book, and they cannot be dealt with individually as they all communicate. And this is what constructs what is a sometimes excessively complex history of this book. Now, to try to then tackle the historical problem of the Book of Saint Cyprian, one way that we can go about it is through ethnography. It's not easy. It's not hard to realize that many procedures, many sorceries, and many techniques described in the contemporary 19th century book, if we read works of 19th century ethnographers such as José Leite de Vasconcelos or Teófilo Braga, often we will notice that folk magic procedures that these men collected in regular field work exist almost exactly the same in the Book of Saint Cyprian, suggesting a certain folk origin. A good example of this is the triangle of disenchantment, which is a symbol of protection prescribed for the disenchantment of treasure, which José Leite de Vasconcelos very accurately points out is called a sino Simão dobrado, which is a double sign of Solomon, a folk symbol for the protection usually of beasts of burden. So, if we're dealing with the Portuguese Book of Saint Cyprian, some of the initial sources we can go for to try to understand this book is, firstly, like I said, ethnographical sources. The already mentioned José Leite de Vasconcelos and Teófilo Braga are fundamental in this aspect, but also another individual, which I'll discuss later on, a man called Francisco Martins Sarmento. However, if we want to go back from the 19th century to the 17th or 16th or 18th century, another set of sources that usually tend to be very prolific is obviously the records of the Portuguese Inquisition. Now, for those who don't know, the Portuguese Inquisition is divided into three branches. You have the Évora Inquisition, which had jurisdiction over the south of the country, the Lisbon Inquisition, which had jurisdiction over a small band in central Portugal, plus all our imperial possessions, particularly in Africa and Brazil. And then you have the Coimbra Inquisition, which had jurisdiction over the north of the country. When we analyze the records of the Portuguese Inquisition, mentions to the Book of Saint Cyprian overwhelmingly appear in the Coimbra Inquisition, meaning that the pre-contemporary books of Saint Cyprian are a product of the Portuguese north. So even still, limiting our sight to the Coimbra Inquisition, there are still two types of documents that we can examine in order to explore instances of the Book of Saint Cyprian in Portuguese Inquisition. You can, first of all, look at formal Inquisition trials. Obviously, individuals caught with books of Saint Cyprian or mentioning them will be caught, imprisoned and prosecuted, and so we can look at their trials, what they said and what they were accused of. But another type of documentation, which is some of what I'm still exploring right now, is something called the prosecutor's notebooks. The prosecutor's notebooks are basically every single document and piece of paper that the Inquisition produced, which did not give rise to a formal trial, gets collected in the prosecutor's notebooks. These are gigantic stacks of paper, thousands of pages long, and in them you can find pretty much anything, from your run-of-the-mill Judaism accusations to witchcraft to books of Saint Cyprian to things that were so bizarre that the inquisitors couldn't even comprehend them to the point of calling them heresy. So you can find the most outlandish things and the most interesting things in these notebooks, but obviously there are hundreds of them, thousands of pages. This takes years to examine. So having these two document sources, what I'm now going to do is largely following a purely chronological order, mentioning every single instance of a mention of a Book of Saint Cyprian I found. And starting with that, in 1620 in a place called Fornelos, north of Portugal, obviously. This is a trial. Now, this is the trial of Pedro Afonso. This is, as far as I know, the first explicit reference to something called Book of Saint Cyprian. Pedro Afonso was a folk healer from the north. He described some of the practices that he did. It wasn't all that different from general folk magic practices. But he does mention that about 37 years before his trial, he met a man who owned the Book of Saint Cyprian, which told him that book was very good for mostly healing. So Pedro asked for a copy to be made, and the copy was made. And it's also mentioned that besides this new book that was being produced, being a copy of the previous book, new procedures and new elements were added to it, which suggests that there is a certain fluidity in these early versions of the book. There wasn't a set index. It's something that would be constructed throughout time. Now, not many years after that, I think 7 years after that, Pedro does mention that he destroyed his version of the book for whatever reason. He doesn't explain why. But from the several questionings and his confessions, we can piece together that the book mentioned procedures to heal individuals near rivers or fountains or bridges, usually using a sword, and you should do a small bloodletting on usually a person's finger, and let this blood fall into the flow of the river so that this would be washed away. These types of procedures that could be used on people, animals, and even mills and tools and rifles. And if the patient was so ill that they could not go to a fountain, it's also possible to collect water from a fountain that never dried and perform the same ritual at this person's home. Explicitly, this book contained the prayer of Saint Cyprian. There are further banishments of sorcery using herbs, salt, prayers, and pentagrams, remedies for scrofula and paralysis. And besides this, the book was also used as a talisman to facilitate childbirth and provide breast milk. Now, this last characteristic of this book suggests itself as being somewhat related to the presence of the prayer of Saint Cyprian in this book. the presence of the prayer of Saint Cyprian somehow gave a certain talismanic property to the book, as typically, even in the 17th century, simple collections of papers containing the prayer of Saint Cyprian were used as talismans. It's a talismanic prayer by virtue of it being written and not so much by virtue of it being said. Furthermore, what is also interesting is that even though Pedro owned this book, he was illiterate. He could not read. So it is even somewhat ambiguous what the content of the book was. Inquisition documentation is extremely stylized, and sometimes it's not easy to understand exactly what's being discussed if these several procedures were in fact written in the book and Pedro somehow had memorized them, or if these were simply other healings that he would use in conjunction with the book without the two being intrinsically related. Now, there is an academic point that can be made about the prayer of Saint Cyprian written on a piece of paper. What is often suggested is that during this time period, any collection of pieces of paper which had the prayer of Saint Cyprian written on it could be given the name Book of Saint Cyprian. This is an extrapolation from several trials. However, this is very rarely explicitly expressed, to the point that if we're looking for explicit mentions to the words Book of Saint Cyprian, the next one we find is in the 18th century, about 100 years later. But what we do find with relative ease is several trials of people simply having collections of papers with the prayer of Saint Cyprian and other prayers. Now, if we can consider these objectively to be Book of Saint Cyprian trials, like I said, this is an academic point; it's debatable. But I did not add those to this presentation. I'm trying to stick with explicit mentions to Books of Saint Cyprian. And as such, the next one we have is 1722-3 in Guimarães. Now, it should be noted that, as is obvious, magical practice tends to follow its own, let's call it, fashion. Magical styles tend to fall in and out of favor with populations as time goes by. One particular preoccupation with magical practice in the 18th century, as noted throughout Europe and in Portugal, obviously, is that of magical treasure hunting. In Portugal, as soon as you cross into the 18th century, immediately you find dozens of trials of individuals being accused of magical treasure hunting. However, if you collect all of those and you really boil them down, you realize that actually these are like 3 or 4 different cases. Simply, these cases refer to large groups of individuals with dozens of members each, which were all caught. So you have all these dozens of cases, but they're actually referring to very small pockets of treasure hunting. And this is one such case. In the 20s of the 18th century, a group was active in Guimarães searching for treasure. These are some of the names of their members. These aren't all of the members, because another problem, another particularity of studying the Portuguese Inquisition is that, particularly the Coimbra Inquisition, you frequently don't examine the trials that you want to examine. You examine the trials that they let you examine. The Portuguese National Archives, that holds the Inquisition records, are perhaps excessively zealous in their safeguarding of their documents, so any piece of paper which has the slightest damage, you will not be allowed to check. So these are simply the names of the individuals that I was able to examine. There are many more. But still, let's see what this group mentioned about their practices using a Book of Saint Cyprian. So, António Fernandes. This man simply claims to have been the translator of a French manuscript book on treasure disenchantment. Luís de Azevedo mentions that a priest joined this group, a man called Duarte Correia de Lacerda, and he saw him with 2 books, one written in French and the other in Portuguese. João Mendes mentions that there was a Frenchman in the group. Manuel Fernandes mentions a group of between 12 to 15 people toppling stones in search for treasure in a place called Citânia, which is usually a name given to a hill fort or a pre-Roman ruin. He mentions that he saw a priest reading exorcisms and saw another man casting rods, meaning using rhabdomancy to find treasure, and reading from a book. He further says that he saw two people appear on horseback, and they placed a rope around the hole that they were digging so as the treasure that supposedly was in that hole would not move. There are further mentions of pentacles with a circle around them, the burning of sulfur wicks, prayers and divinations with rods, and floggings of the location. Another man mentions that he saw people touching the ground with the book. It's also noticeable as time went by and rituals followed rituals, this group tended to start implementing certain variations on their ritual. One of them was quite long and interesting. They mentioned that the two notebooks, the French and the Portuguese one, were read at a crossroad on a Friday at midnight by a priest placed inside a Simsaimon, which is a name for a pentacle. This called the devil 70 times by the names Lucifer and Beelzebub. This should appear in a chariot of fire to find treasure. Even still, digging would still be needed to be done, as well as divination using 4 different rods. As an offering, they would give the devil 1 single drop of Christian blood, a living kid goat, the foot of a grown goat, lamb's blood, a 3-pound bread, 2 living roosters, and 3 candles. Furthermore, the book is explicitly mentioning as having the prayer of Saint Cyprian. The next case, 1774, Carrezeda de Anciães. This is from a prosecutor's notebook. So as this is just loose documentation, the denunciation is itself quite fragmented. So it's kind of hard to figure out exactly what's being discussed. But this is the case of Martinho Gonçalves. And it simply says the following. He has a Book of Saint Cyprian with 2 rods of enchanting and counting, which I have seen used as well as several other people. And the lightning of the uncertain word, it's difficult to read, using a candle and roaming in the night by fountains and paths. And furthermore, he usually passes and enters into houses where there are people, and during the day without being seen, and during the night with the light still on. He does the same, which has happened to me, the denouncer. So even though we do have a prevalence of magical treasure hunting associated with Cyprian books in the 18th century, it seems that still this wasn't the sole purpose of these books. What seems to be described here is something similar to a hand of glory somehow, some kind of magical implement that would allow an individual to enter into a person's house without them noticing. Next case, still in the prosecutor's notebooks, from Vinhais, the case against Isabel de Morais. She goes on to make cures and find treasure, and wanting to discover stolen things, saying to these rustic people that for all of this she used the Book of Saint Cyprian, and that, without it, she could do no such things. I confirmed this after careful diligence, and I learned that the book she used for this deception was an old one of Virgil, and this is in my possession. So this is an interesting case. It's admittedly a fake book being described here. This does not offer much elements about the history of individual books, but rather to the history of the idea of the Book of Saint Cyprian, that any book taken and claimed to be a Book of Saint Cyprian would become somehow of a source of authority. This isn't the only case of a fake Book of Saint Cyprian, which I know of. There's one which, again, is not explicit. It doesn't mention the words Book of Saint Cyprian. But it mentions something similar, which is a case from a guy from Leiria, which is actually my hometown, a surgeon from Leiria who goes into Lisbon, and he had a surgery book with an illustration of Saint Cosmas and Damian, and he would claim that that was an image of Saint Cyprian. So while the name Book of Saint Cyprian is never used, this was his claim to magical authority, that he had a book with the picture of Saint Cyprian on it. Now, I didn't include it here because it's an ambiguous reference, but this type of fakery is somewhat common. Another instance in Braga, 1788. This is an interesting one. This is the case against, this is a trial, the case against Diogo José Barbosa. This guy was a notary from Braga, and it seems at a certain point, an individual approached him and asked him to copy a book that he had. It apparently was a Book of Saint Cyprian. And this is what's mentioned. For having him, the defendant, copied from the said man a book out of another, also written by hand in the Portuguese language, old and very used, which spoke greatly of treasures, and it had some figures painted in black ink, which he, the defendant, also copied, all in the same way as it was there, and he doesn't remember nor investigated what they meant, only that he thought it was all meant for the discovery of enchanted treasures. The book was actually apprehended by the Inquisition and examined, and this is what Diogo José Barbosa further said about it. And being the said manuscript shown to him, bound in a quarter folder, and that it starts with spirit, and below, inside the circle, the man with the discalced feet, and it finished of Saint Cyprian Martyr. Being this same book with almost half of its pages blank, and which are all those from that point on. And after carefully seen and examined by him, he said, without a doubt, this was the same that he had mentioned in his confession and had copied with his hand. Now, what's important about this case is that it is explicitly mentioned that the book that the Inquisition apprehended was attached to the trial of Diogo José Barbosa's accomplice. I have not been able to find this trial so far. I have tried to find it. It is quite possible that the trial got simply destroyed 200 years ago, or somehow got lost. Or it's also possible that the documentation being collected for the trial of his accomplice actually didn't give rise to a trial, which would mean that this book is stored somewhere in a prosecutor's notebook. But as I mentioned, you don't examine what you want, you examine what they let you examine. So I haven't been able to examine all the notebooks from the Coimbra Inquisition, not because of lack of trying, but simply because so far I haven't been able to. But I'm still hopeful that there is that this Book of Saint Cyprian is out there somewhere to be found. I haven't given up on this one yet. Next case, in São Amé da Ribatua. We're already approaching the 19th century, and this is an interesting one. I found two different individuals giving this same denunciation. This is the most complete of the two. A denunciation by Francisco Pinto. Watching a puddle of water, we felt people and went to peek and saw that there were 3 people, and coming near some chestnut trees, we heard the voice of one of the trees, and it said said to the others that they not speak, and we knew the one speaking. It was the vicar José de Barros Falcão, priest of that same church, and this said that much money would come out, and the same placed his surplice and stole, and made a new fire, and lit 2 candles, and placed them inside 2 lamps, and sat in the middle, casting holy water, and took a rod, and made a circle, and hit the floor once to the north, and another to the south, and opened a missal. He was reading, and afterwards took a book of Gospels, and also read some, and then took another book, and was also reading from this, and as we heard of Saint Cyprian, we were afraid and ran away. Now, arriving at the 19th century, we're not that far away from the contemporary printed books, so we're taking a small ethnographic break. It's interesting to notice that when we arrive at the 19th century and we read the works of the same ethnographers that I've mentioned before, José Leite de Vasconcelos and Teófilo Braga, every time these individuals ask a rural population, what do they think about the Book of Saint Cyprian? What is a Book of Saint Cyprian to a rural population? The descriptions that these receive are consistent. And they frequently receive answers mentioning that a Book of Saint Cyprian is a book that, using all of 3 branches, and with the assistance of a priest, is used to disenchant treasure. They further mention that the whole book is used to disenchant treasure, suggesting that in this conception, the Book of Saint Cyprian isn't a fragmented object, it's a whole thing. So what this suggests is that when we arrive at the 19th century, when an ethnographer asks a rural individual, what is a Book of Saint Cyprian, the answer he gets is a description of an 18th century Book of Saint Cyprian. Not only do we see this in just regular ethnography, but if we start examining folk legends and narratives, the Book of Saint Cyprian as an object is frequently mentioned in these, and the description of the book which is made in these same narratives is exactly the same as that of an 18th century book. So obviously this suggests that these are too many instances for us to doubt that books such as this ever actually existed. But obviously for the longest time we didn't know how these books even looked like, or even if they were all that real, until I think 2016, where I finally managed to locate one of these books. This is manuscript 2559 of the which currently rests at the reserved sections of the University of Coimbra library. It's been given the name Various Prayers to Drive Away the Devil, which suggests that whoever cataloged this book or gave it its title didn't really know what they were looking for, and I don't blame them for it. It's specialized information. But what this is, when I first examined this book, it very clearly became clear that this was an 18th century manuscript Book of Saint Cyprian, simply because it uses the prayer of Saint Cyprian consistently to find treasure. It describes the use of olive tree branches as rods to locate treasure, and it seems to suggest that it needs to be used by a priest. So this follows the description exactly of an 18th century book, both according to the Inquisition records and according to oral folk narratives. So what I'm now going to do is simply go through this book. I suppose some of you will know this book by now. I've published it in 2 different forms, but I'm still going to go through it and just to present a description of what at least this one instance of an 18th century Book of Saint Cyprian actually looks like. So the book opens actually with two different crosses. These are clearly talismanic crosses. The first one seems to be an adaptation of the Cruz Angelica, which is attributed to St. Thomas Aquinas. It's as a protection from lightning usually. And the second one, while having a completely diverse form, the letters that make it up are actually the same of the St. Benedict medal, which spells out an exorcism. The book opens by what it calls the first fortification, which is actually a Lorica prayer. Lorica prayers are prayers of a medieval tradition, mostly monastic tradition, and they usually mention the several parts of the body of the user, and they invoke a certain divine power to protect it. It follows this with a challenge to the devil, which is assumed to be the spirit guarding a buried treasure. There are mentions of the use of relics and the cross. Then the actual treasure disenchantment begins. There are mentions of the use of holy water and incense, use of Latin liturgical hymns and Latin psalms, which then suggests that this needs to be used by a priest, because even though the book is written in Portuguese, a priest in the 18th century would be the individual with access to Latin literature and actually be able to read it. There is then mentions of the use of magical rods, and you start to find elements of the prayer of Saint Cyprian, which is a piece of text with a very characteristic and identifiable structure. It's very easy to spot when the prayer of Saint Cyprian is being used. Then you have a whole bunch of sections which basically are just the constant repetition of the prayer of Saint Cyprian over and over again. The beginning of the prayer of Saint Cyprian, second prayer of Saint Cyprian, conjuration of Saint Cyprian, exorcism of Saint Cyprian, and conjuration of Saint Cyprian again. But as this whole text moves forward, it's noticeable that you start to find certain sections and certain paragraphs which are no longer part of the prayer of Saint Cyprian. So there are certain alterations that are being made to the prayer. Whether these are original or not, I cannot say, obviously. Now, this is the first part of the book. The book has 2 parts. The second part seems to be more technical in nature. It opens with the first general disenchantment, which just seems to have a collection of magic words. There is an argument to be made whether these are just magic words or actual names of spirits. Then it has a second general disenchantment through herbs, which is basically just instructions to make a kind of holy water. And then there are what it calls preparations for the disenchantment, which is just instructions on how to use the holy water prepared, how to prepare the ritual space where the disenchantment will take place, and with further use of Latin litanies and psalms. And finally, it has 2 different methods for the creation of rhabdomancy wands to locate treasure. Now finally, the very last page of this book has a somewhat faded inscription. I can at least make out Josefa Lopes da Freguesia de São Cristóvão de Abação de Guimarães. This is a name and a location. Josefa Lopes is a female name. This likely was not the person who wrote this book, but it might have been an owner at some point. But what this also says, and what is quite valuable, is gives you a location. São Cristóvão de Abação, which is a very small village, de Guimarães, in Guimarães. In Guimarães is a city which we have seen. There are records of magical treasure hunting using books of Saint Cyprian there, so this makes sense. Now, before I proceed, there's a very important point. Even though books of Saint Cyprian in the 18th century are largely treasure hunting books, books of Saint Cyprian and treasure hunting books need to be understood to be completely different literary traditions, which simply in the 18th century somewhat overlap. We have seen that there are 18th century mentions to books of Saint Cyprian not used for treasure hunting, and more recently, last September, I found this. This is a treasure hunting book written in Castilian and Latin, so from an Iberian origin, which at no point mentions Saint Cyprian or uses the prayer of Saint Cyprian. This is an Iberian, non-Cyprian treasure hunting book. So these need to be understood as simply still distinct things. Now, about this book, I have done some research on it. I haven't translated it yet. I did manage to figure out that this particular manuscript belonged to a man called Bento Falcão da Frota, which I believe is that gentleman right there. This was a nobleman. He lived in Lisbon, was somewhat relevant. And his name is also associated with another manuscript which currently rests in the Portuguese National Library, which basically is his personal account of his adventures of treasure hunting. This seems to have been a man very much obsessed with treasure hunting, and even though I haven't read this book or examined it at length, it's quite a gem. It has several descriptions of pre-Christian ruins and standing stones where this man conducted his investigations, several inscriptions that he found and transcribed to where that he believed indicated the presence of treasure. And besides his own first-hand account of treasure hunting, the book also contains a translation of a French book of rhabdomancy. So this seems to be an individual quite committed to the whole magical practice of treasure hunting. This will be, hopefully, at least a paper in the future, hopefully a book too. So now, this was a large detour, but back to the Inquisition. Already in the 19th century, 1902, back in Braga. This is the case of Rafael Lopes de Ramos Fonseca. This was a priest, and his trial is not so much a trial of magical practice. Rafael Lopes de Ramos Fonseca was a famous exorcist in Braga, but the problem was that he didn't have a license to practice exorcism. So the trial is about his lack of license. However, among the several practices that are described in this trial, and in particular one particular case that he had, there is a mention of the Book of Saint Cyprian, and this is the case of, he had a client, somewhat, I believe, a wealthy woman, who was very ill. And Father Rafael's diagnosis was that the illness was actually caused by a treasure that was buried in this woman's basement. This treasure was being guarded by a demon, and the demon was causing the disease. So his method of tackling the problem would be, I'm going to use the Book of Saint Cyprian to disenchant this treasure. Consequently, the demon will be driven away, and the illness will go away also, and we will also become rich. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a good description of his book or what he was doing with it, because every time he used it, he usually locked himself in the room. So we just have these fragmented reports of what he was doing. There are mentions of used herbs and holy water from 3 male churches, which are churches dedicated to a male saint. He drew circles on the floor and read from manuscript book, which is again explicitly mentioned as a Book of Saint Cyprian. When his rituals didn't produce effect, he would use sieve divination to fine-tune his ritual proceedings, see if he was doing anything wrong. And also his exorcisms usually use the concept of opening and closing bodies. These last 2 points are interesting because sieve divination and the concept of the open body, which is common in the Portuguese north, are both of them already present in the contemporary printed books. So we seem to be approaching something that can already be identified from our contemporary eyes as we understand the Book of Saint Cyprian to be. However, the 19th century brings with it further complications. What the 19th century seems to offer to the Saint Cyprian book tradition is the influx of non-Iberian or external influences from other French grimoires and Italian grimoires. Another ethnographer, Francisco Martins Sarmento. Now, Sarmento was a very relevant ethnographer in his time. He is considered to be the first Portuguese archaeologist, and he was from Guimarães, by the way. Currently in Guimarães there is a group of individuals, something called the Martins Sarmento House, which is a group that's dedicated to the preservation of the work of Martins Sarmento and its study. And one of the things they have there is that they have Sarmento's field notebooks. So the actual notes that he took while out on archaeological digs or doing ethnographic work. And one of these, Notebook 37, has notes on what Sarmento calls 2 books of Saint Cyprian, one of which he refers to as Pai Santo or Holy Father, and another one as Livro do Rei São Cipriano or Book of King Saint Cyprian. It's interesting to note that even though these are the titles of these books, he still refers to them as books of Saint Cyprian. Now, I went to Guimarães a few years ago to examine Sarmento's notes on these books to try to figure out what were these things that he was referring to as books of Saint Cyprian. First of all, the Pai Santo, the Holy Father, is very easy to figure out. This is actually a Portuguese translation of the grimoire of Pope Honorius with elements from the Heptameron. These are 2 French grimoires. And what's interesting here is that the Pai Santo isn't simply a passive translation of these 2 grimoires. It's actually a reformulation or a reuse of the ritual proceedings or methodologies of the grimoire of Pope Honorius to retailor it for the purpose of treasure hunting. So it seems that in changing, independently of the origin of a book, in the Portuguese context in the 19th century, by changing the purpose of a magic book into that of treasure hunting, it seems that this book somehow acquired the title Book of Saint Cyprian or was perceived as a Book of Saint Cyprian by the local population. The Book of King Saint Cyprian is pretty much the same thing, but it's simply a translation of the Grand Grimoire. It's true that the Grand Grimoire is already a book with considerable, where treasure hunting has considerable relevance in the whole ritual proceeding, but here the ritual of the Grand Grimoire is given as the sole purpose. The treasure hunting is given as the sole purpose of the ritual of the Grand Grimoire. And it's even cool, you can check Sarmento makes a small diagram of the protection circle from the Grand Grimoire. It seems to match pretty well. Now, the Book of King Saint Cyprian is particular in that, like Manuscript 2559, it has 2 parts. The first part is the Grand Grimoire ritual, and the second part is more fragmented. It's a collection of divination procedures, sorceries to drive away witches and evil spirits and that kind of thing. And it also presents alternative methods of disenchantment, one of which is the following. To disenchant true herbs in a boiling, valeto or roleto, I don't know what this herb is. Alder, buckthorn, leaves of ash tree, rue, thistle, garlic, rose water, all boiled in street water, again an uncertain translation. Baptize the place where one thinks treasure is, all shall be immediately unbound. Now this becomes extremely relevant if we go back to Manuscript 2559, where we have a recipe for holy water, which is the following. Viloto or releto, leaves of knotgrass, leaves of ash tree, tettleworth or celandine, sow thistle, onions, garlic, rosemary water, all of these boiled with border water and very well spread around the place where one has suspicions that there are treasures, and immediately these will be unbound and disenchanted. Now, while this isn't a full equivalence, there are some differences. There is a clear relationship between these 2 pieces of text, which suggests that I'm not going to claim a direct genealogical relationship between these two books, but at least we can say that they belong to the same literary tradition, that neither of these books exist in a vacuum, that they are inserted in a certain textual continuity. Moving forward, another ethnographer, Francisco Adolfo Coelho. Now, this man wrote the first tentatively academic paper on Saint Cyprian. This was the paper, Notas e Paralelos Folclóricos, Tradições Relativas a São Cipriano, or Folkloric Notes and Parallels, Traditions Mentioning Saint Cyprian, in the first issue of the Revista Lusitana in 1888. This paper, besides discussing some traditions, folk traditions regarding Saint Cyprian, also offers descriptions and analysis of a few printed books of Saint Cyprian. We're already at the period where printed books were starting to appear. And it's interesting that although Francisco Adolfo Coelho mentions printed books, which are today completely unknown. So even besides the manuscript books being still somewhat of a mystery, the printed books are also still a mystery. There's a lot about the early editions we don't know. So this is still quite open. However, another book that he mentions, he says he found it in the possession of a man called António da Silva Túlio. This was the director of the Portuguese National Library in the 19th century. And Francisco Adolfo Coelho claims that this man had a book of Saint Cyprian and examined this book to some extent in this paper. He takes some excerpts from it. The book is written in somewhat broken Latin. Adolfo Coelho doesn't go into a particular extent about it. He actually ends up complaining that, given that António da Silva Túlio died in 1884, he was unable to continue his research on this book. And for all accounts, it seems that after 84, the book actually disappeared. He does mention, however, that the book was called Cypriani Magic Septem Horae Magicae, or the 7 Magical Hours of Saint Cyprian. And the book was missing. Several people tried to locate it, me included, until quite recently. There is an issue with the Portuguese National Library, which is, even though they have an extensive online catalog, that catalog is incomplete. So there are numerous titles and books that haven't been passed from the analog catalogs to the digital ones. To figure this out, to find these books, you need to go the old-fashioned way and look at drawers with thousands of tiny little notes in them. And this is what I've been doing for the past months. After I figured out that there was the possibility of something quite interesting being in the National Library that was never put online, I went a few times there and spent several hours going through thousands of little notes to see if I could find something interesting, and eventually something interesting was found. The Septem Horae Magicae was found. This was the state of the book when I found it, extraordinarily damaged, to the point that I was actually not allowed to examine it when I originally found it, which was back in April. We can tell that we can see there's a small stamp at the corner saying Compra. This means that the National Library bought this book probably in 1884, as I know that the library of António da Silva Túlio was auctioned, so probably the library bought the whole thing. And the book was never actually lost, it was just there, that nobody ever thought about trying to find it, this way at least. So I wasn't allowed to touch it, but I did manage to speak with the director of the Reserved and Manuscript section of the National Library, and I explained to her how rare this book was, how important it was, that it needed to be restored as quickly as possible and hopefully digitalized so that proper academic work can be done about it. I gave her all the story I knew about this book from Adolfo Coelho's paper, and she agreed to place it somewhat high up on the priorities list of the National Library. There were some incentives needed that I would rather not mention. I don't think they were illegal, but anyway. A few months later, I was notified that the book had been restored and it was now available. And this is how it ended up. Obviously, restoration does not produce miracles. Whatever is lost. But at least now we know nothing more will be lost. So we can now look at what is this extraordinary example of a pre-contemporary 19th century book. I assume it's 19th century, and see what else can be extracted from this. So first of all, as mentioned by Adolfo Coelho, the book is written in an extraordinarily broken Latin. We've already had it translated. We hired Brian Johnson to do the translation, the guy who did Necromancy in the Medici Library. He mentions that the work was quite hard. There are the extremely broken, truncated words. Sometimes he had to hop between Latin and Greek to make sense of what was being written. This, to me, immediately suggests that this book might be a historical fraud. Books of Saint Cyprian are typically written in Portuguese, even though Latin is used, but they are typically written in Portuguese. These come from a folk context. This weird language seems probably like an elaborate joke, maybe. And also, this is clearly not manuscript. Adolfo Coelho mentioned this was made using a manual printing press, which is weird. If you're going to the trouble of printing out a book, even if it's a manual press, it makes sense that you would produce multiple copies, because it's the same amount of work. If the plates are ready, you can make as many books as you want. So it would make sense there would be more books like this. But I don't know. I don't know. The very existence and the external characteristics of this book make no sense. Even still, well, Brian did manage to produce a text, English text. It is still extremely hard to follow what the book says. But we can make something out. It seems that the book seems to be... we can divide it into 5 different parts. The first part is an introduction, where it is explicitly mentioned that this book is of the magic of Lucifuge Rocofole, which is obviously one of the more relevant spirits of the Grand Grimoire. So you have here a new introduction of at least a Grand Grimoire influence in the Portuguese Saint Cyprian tradition, which is interesting because the Grand Grimoire is quite influential, particularly in the Spanish traditions, not so much in the Portuguese one. Besides that, there are somewhat relevant mentions to the use of planetary hours, and this book is explicitly meant for the disenchantment of Moorish treasure, which is the typical conceptualization of buried treasure in Portugal. It's Moorish treasure. The second part are instructions for the construction of a talisman. Now, talisman is an uncertain translation. This is Brian's best. And the instructions are hard to follow until you realize that the very last page contains a small illustration which looks like an astrological chart, but it's actually not. This is what you're supposed to build. So every like thing, these are all sticks from different trees. You need to cut them at particular planetary hours. Some of these are extraordinarily exotic, such as cinnamon. You're not only supposed to produce one of these, you're supposed to produce 7 of these, and then you find a rod that goes through all of them, and you attach a blackbird's head with a cat's eye to the rod, and then you tie a cord with those words written on it. This is my interpretation of what it's supposed to look like. I think you're supposed to hang this vertically. So you have the 7 talismans that you're supposed to build horizontally with the rod in the middle, the black cat's eye with the blackbird head, and somehow you hang this with the cord. I think. I'm not offended if anybody disagrees with me. The text is extraordinarily complicated. What this also seems to suggest is that all these different parts are meant to be able to rotate independently of each other. So this is some kind of mechanism that through its rotation somehow locates treasure. And also important to notice is that the sides of this square here are 50 inches or 127 centimeters, which makes this huge. This is a gigantic thing. So after that's done, there are instructions to perform a pact with Lucifugio Roccofoli, with a recipe for magical incense and candles. And it seems that this pact is fundamental for the mechanism to actually function. Next, it gives the ritual of disenchantment with further recipes for incense, and it is suggested that at the end of the ritual, the mechanism is supposed to be destroyed. Finally, there is a list of psalms to be recited during the several planetary hours. It seems that as the ritual elongates itself throughout the evening, you are supposed to recite particular psalms at particular times. And that's it. That's what the book is. This is also pretty much all I got on pre-contemporary books. So there are some final considerations we can throw out. Obviously, this investigation, this research isn't done. This isn't so much a story, a coherent story, as it is just a collection of observations. There isn't enough information still to clearly sketch out what was the history of all these books and how do they arrive at the present. Obviously, the correct avenue to take, the only avenue available, is continued research in the Coimbra Inquisition. At this point, that's nearly impossible. There will need to be at some point an effort, either by a group of dedicated individuals or even a public institution that finally decides to fund the preservation and digitalization of the Coimbra Inquisition, as has happened with the Lisbon Inquisition. Right now, investigation in the Lisbon Inquisition is extraordinarily easy because it was all digitalized. But obviously not only, I cannot claim just we need to look at the Coimbra Inquisition, we need to look at the Évora Inquisition and every other piece of Inquisition documentation available. So I don't know how this can be done, but it needs to be done. There's no way around it. And then looking at the contemporary book now, it becomes obvious. This is a clear descendant of everything we've been talking about. As I've mentioned, the first part of the Book of Saint Cyprian has a prescription of the prayer of Saint Cyprian for the banishment of spirits and sorcery, like the Pedro Afonso book. It also has a use of the prayer of Saint Cyprian to disenchant treasure, like most 18th century books and manuscripts 2559. And besides this, the second and third part have all these different collections of sorceries, which some of which, even though the literary tradition of the Book of Saint Cyprian comes from the north, many of these collected sorceries are actually identifiable with particular styles of magical practice from the south, particularly from Lisbon. Meaning that the book itself, the content of the book itself, suggests its gradual transition from the Portuguese north to the Portuguese south, where it is actually printed now. But still, it is wrong to look at the contemporary book and treat it either as a passive child of the pre-contemporary books or as their final crowning achievement. This isn't the correct way to look at things, because all of these books are, including the contemporary book, they are products of their context. Each of these books is an object in itself and needs to be treated as an object in itself. They all translate cultural, social, and economic preoccupations typical of their regions and of their time. And it is only by looking at all of them individually that a coherent story between them can actually be drawn. Thank you.